My name is Chazan Matt Osterklein. I'm the cantor here at Congregation Anshai Torah, and I'd be honored if you would join me in a profession of faith on this night of witness. Ani Ma'amin, page 5. Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin, Be'emunah shelema, Be'emunah shelema, Beviat HaMashiach, Beviat HaMashiach, Ani Ma'amin, Ve'af al pi she'yitmamea, Im kol ze Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin, Ani Ma'amin, Be'emunah shlema, Be'emunah shlema, Beviat HaMashiach, Beviat HaMashiach, Ani Ma'amin, Ve'af al pi she'yitmamea, Im kol ze Ani Ma'amin.
One of the most profound parts of my childhood in South Florida was the opportunity to hear testimony from many Holocaust survivors. I continue to cherish the chance to learn from every survivor. While each testimony is often filled with sadness and loss, so many are filled with hope and resilience. It is an honor to welcome so many survivors to Anshai Torah this evening, along with members of your extended family. It's humbling to stand before you. I'm often asked, why does the Jewish community commemorate the Shoah on a different date than the rest of the world? Yes, we recall the 6 million lives brutally taken from our world, but we also recall the bravery and heroism of every victim of the Shoah and every single survivor. We refuse to accept the past as it was. Rather, we use the memory of those that were slaughtered, along with the testimony of survivors, to change the world. As we begin Yom HaShoah, may the memories of those murdered and the living examples in this room of the best of humanity challenge us to help build the world that we know is possible. I want to conclude this evening my remarks by sharing a prayer that was written by the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Today, he writes, on Yom HaShoah, we remember the victims of the greatest crime of man against man, the young, the old, the innocent, the 1.5 million children, starved, shot, given lethal injections, gassed, burned, and turned to ash, because they were deemed guilty of the crime of being different. We remember what happens when hate takes hold of the human heart and it turns to stone. What happens when victims cry for help and there is no one listening? What happens when humanity fails to recognize that those who are not in our image are nonetheless in God's image. We remember and pay tribute to the survivors who bore witness to what happened and to the victims, so that robbed of their lives, they would not be robbed also of their deaths. We remember and give thanks for the righteous of the nations who saved lives, often at a risk to their own, teaching us how in the darkest night we can light a candle of hope. Today on Yom HaShoah, we call on you, Almighty God, to help us hear your voice that says in every generation, do not murder, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, do not oppress the stranger. We know that while we do not have the ability to change the past, we can change the future. We know that while we cannot bring the dead back to life, we can ensure their memories live on and their deaths were not in vain. And so on Yom HaShoah, we commit ourselves to one simple act, Yizkor, remember. May the souls of the victims be bound in bond of everlasting life. And let us all say, Amen. I now will light the first memorial candle this evening. I light this candle in memory of 1 million of the 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust.
Thank you, Rabbi Kushnick, for your moving introduction. We are all very grateful to you and Congregation Anshai Torah for welcoming us tonight and hosting this in your beautiful sanctuary. Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the president and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. It's especially sweet to see so many of our survivors here tonight, along with many friends and community members. Tonight, we gather to remember the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust at the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators. This is a time for us to reflect not only on the scale of the devastation, but on the individual lives taken. Each person a world unto themselves, with a name, a story, a family, and a future that was stolen. As we remember the Holocaust, we think of the 1.5 million children who never had the chance to grow up, the parents who never returned home, the families torn apart, and the vibrant communities that were destroyed. In doing so, we recognize that memory is not passive. To uphold memory is a responsibility that we all share. We must remember those who were lost and listen to the voices of the survivors. Where those voices have faded, we carry their stories forward with everlasting commitment. Tonight, we will hear from third and fourth generations. These descendants of survivors will share their grandparents' and great-grandparents' stories of survival, and how they endured and began anew despite the difficulties and pain of rebuilding their lives after liberation. For most, liberation was bittersweet. While they were free from Nazi persecution, their futures were uncertain. They were battered, ill, and without homes to return to. Through these stories, we will learn about the uncertain and fraught conditions of displaced persons camps, how survivors slowly recovered, and how they embarked on a new chapter in their lives in spite of the tremendous losses they had endured. Finally, we will see how they found the strength to rebuild their lives and families, a key insight into the resilience of the Jewish people and human spirit in the darkest of times. Yom HaShoah is therefore not only a day of mourning, but also a call to confront anti-Semitism in its ugliness, wherever and whenever it reemerges in our world, and to recognize the frightful consequences of silence and indifference, not only for the Jewish people, but for us all, in the lessening of our humanity if we ignore this scourge on the world. As we light candles of remembrance tonight, we affirm that those who were lost are not forgotten, that their lives mattered and continue to matter, and that their memories endure through the way we choose to live and act in the world today. I would now like to light our next candle of remembrance. I light this candle in memory of 1 million of the 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust. And now I would like to invite Dylan and Garrett Gasworth, great-grandsons of Holocaust survivors Leon and Libby Baxt, and grandsons of Marcia Gasworth, one of our lifetime directors. Please come share their story.
Our great-grandfather, Leon Baxt, was born in 1923 to a middle-class Jewish family. Shortly after his birth, his family fled Tsarist Russia and settled in Evia, Poland, today part of Belarus. As a young boy in Evia, he attended a Jewish school and went to shul with his family. In September 1939, just 3 months after his bar mitzvah, Leon's life changed overnight. Nazi Germany invaded Western Poland while the Soviet Union invaded from the east, and Evia fell under Soviet rule. Our great-grandfather's family was once again under Russian rule, and his life was never the same again. In June 1941, the situation went from bad to worse. Germany launched our Operation Barbarossa, invading eastern Poland and the Soviet Union, and took full control of the region within days. The Nazis forced all Jews to wear the Star of David on their clothing, compelled them to perform forced labor without pay, established a ghetto near the Jewish cemetery, and confiscated their possessions of value.
Our great-grandfather and his brother Jason were a part of a group the Nazis forced to dig 2 deep trenches in a wooded area near the town. They soon realized what they were digging: their own mass graves. Soon after, the Eisengruppen gathered all the Jewish families of Evia in the center of town and ordered them to march towards the woods. Families that were made of mostly men were spared. Family composed primarily of women, children, and the elderly were marched straight to the trenches and shot to death. Leon's family survived that day only because they placed the men at the front of the group so the woman would not be seen. The next day, the SS forced the Jewish laborers, including Leon, to cover the bodies in the trenches with bleach and soil. More than 2,500 people lay in those graves. Years later, when sharing his testimony, our great-grandfather remembered something he could never forget. He said, "We heard voices in those graves, saying, 'Don't bury us, we are alive.' The SS soldier was right with us, and he heard the talking. He took out his pistol from his holster, walked up close to the mass grave, and point blank shot them in the head. In that massacre, our great-grandfather lost 3 uncles, 3 aunts, and 12 cousins.
While Leon and Jason were on their next labor assignment, their parents and sisters were taken away. Our great-grandfather would never see them again and never found out where they were buried. Shortly after this, Leon and his brother, along with a group of about 20 young Jewish men, escaped from their labor detail. They walked for 2 days and nights into the forest without food or water before eventually reaching a group of about 250 Jewish partisans, the famous Bielski Brigade, a Jewish partisan group led by 2 of the Bielski brothers. Over time, their numbers grew to more than 1,250, including fighters, as well as the men, women, and children under their protection. The fact that they took in women and children was very unusual for a partisan group, most of which only accepted men who could fight. Life as a partisan was not easy. The missions were dangerous. As Leon later recalled, everyone had a different assignment. We blew up trains, burned bridges, interrupted communication lines, and cut down telephone poles. The partisans became so effective at disrupting travel that the Nazis assigned thousands of soldiers to guard the trains. But even this did not stop the Jewish resistance. They found new and creative ways to disrupt supplies and Nazi movement.
Eventually, the Nazis surrounded the perimeter of the Naliboki forest in which the Bielski Brigade was hiding and began bombarding the area with artillery. Miraculously, Leon's band of partisans suffered few losses. To escape, they marched through swamps with water up to their necks, pushing forward until they reached safety. With over 1,200 people hiding in the forest, survival was no easy feat. In small groups, they would venture beyond the forest perimeter to seek food from local farmers. Some farmers helped willingly, others needed more convincing. Some of these farmers accepted rewards from the Nazis for turning in Jews hidden on their farms. On several occasions, Leon and his fellow partisans were able to find these Jews and bring them into the forest to safety. Above all else, our grandfather remembered the freedom he felt with the partisans. In the forest, fighting back against the Nazis, he felt invincible, as if angels were protecting him and giving him hope he would survive. In July 1944, as Soviet forces pushed westward, 40,000 partisans living in the forests were liberated. Some joined the Soviet army to continue fighting the Nazis. Others returned to their homes.
Leon did not want to join the Soviets, whom his family had fled. Instead, he returned to his hometown, only to realize that he could not stay. Poles had taken over all the Jewish homes. Family and friends were gone. There was no home for him there. He and his brother traveled to a nearby town where he met our great-grandmother, Libby, along with her brother. Libby was also a partisan and a Holocaust survivor. She had served as a Soviet nurse during the war. Libby and Leon fell in love and were married in a small, informal ceremony by a rabbi in November 1945. The newlyweds knew they had to escape the Soviet-occupied zone, and their best hope was to reach Berlin's American sector. As our great-grandfather later recalled, "We got falsified papers that we are belonging to the Russian army, and we are the medical part. And we made Russian uniforms, officer uniforms, and went from loads on the train with all of the officers of the Russian army. We were in first class." With these forged papers, my great-grandparents made their way to the American zone and arrived at a displaced persons camp in Munich, Germany. The camp, called München Neu Freimann, opened in July 1946 on the site of a former car factory. Its population included both Jewish and non-Jewish Polish displaced persons, though it soon became predominantly Jewish. Survivors lived in confiscated workers' housing with small garden plots. Each building contained 4 rooms, and each room housed one family. In the camp, survivors began rebuilding their lives while still processing the grief of losing so many members of their family. Some were willing to be repatriated to their countries of origin, but for many, they could not or would not return home. Malnourished, ill, and fearful of the authorities, recovery took a long time.
In 1946, General Dwight D. Eisenhower visited the camp after complaints that food and supplies for the Jewish survivors were inadequate. Conditions improved following his visit. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration organized food rations and began to manage the Central Tracing Bureau, which helped survivors locate relatives. The residents of the camp rebuilt a community. They opened a Talmud Torah, established a dental clinic, and gradually transformed the camp into a functioning town. They formed close friendships with other Holocaust survivors, creating a sense of family among people who had endured the unimaginable loss. The camp began to feel like a small city, filled with shared resilience and hope. Our great-grandparents lived in the displaced persons camp in Munich for 3 years, where our grandmother, Marcia, was born on November 5th, 1946. They remained waiting and searching for a place where they could begin again, but their papers had been stolen, and they were forced to wait for new documentation under a strict quota system before they could all leave. At that time, they did not plan to come to America. Like many survivors, they hoped to go to Israel, but it was still under British rule and immigration was extremely limited. In 1949, thanks to our great-grandfather's brother, who already lived in Texas, the young family received visas to travel to the United States and make their way to Houston. Even in America, life was not easy for our great-grandparents. They came to America with nothing, no money, not speaking English, and without any possession, just with each other. In Houston, Leon entered the grocery store business, where he and Libby worked extremely long hours side by side. They also worked to become American citizens. Because the citizenship test was given in English, they first had to learn the language. Our grandmother was 11 years old when they were finally naturalized. Our great-grandparents began as manual laborers in the grocery supply, and over time learned the business, worked their way up, and eventually earned enough to buy their own grocery store. And then eventually the land the store sat on. Through hard work, resilience, and their commitment to one another, they built a life for their daughters, Marcia and her younger sister, Paulette.
When reflecting on his story of survival, our great-grandfather wanted people to understand something very important. He often said that the Jewish people didn't go like sheep into concentration camps. Young people in the thousands joined the underground. Across Nazi-occupied Europe, Jews resisted in many ways through underground movements, partisan groups, and acts of courage that helped others survive. Leon was one of those young Jews who chose to fight back. He said that what kept him going each day was the belief that their actions mattered, that every train they sabotaged, every bridge they destroyed, every supply line they disrupted brought the war one step closer to its end. In his mind, each act of resistance meant that perhaps a few more innocent people might live, and that one day Hitler's regime would fall. I'm standing here today because he was right. His story is the reason I have a voice to share with you at all, because he and others found the courage to fight back, because he chose to survive and then worked to rebuild. Our family is here. Our life together is the quietest, most beautiful answer to the hate that once tried to destroy us. Our family's story teaches us how important it is to stay together even during the hardest times. We carry our names and our history with us openly and proudly because in itself that is an act of resistance. Our great-grandfather's story reminds us that even in the darkest moments of history, there were those who chose courage over fear, resistance over silence, and hope over despair. We now light this candle in memory of 1 million of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust.
in honor of the memory of Leon and Libby Bakst and all other partisans and those who took up arms to resist the evil forces that surrounded them. We sing Zog Nit Kein, which was written in the Vilna ghetto and became known as the Partisaner Lied, the song of the partisans. So if you know it, join me on page 7. Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg, Gott Himmeln bleien, verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show, es wird abheugt in unser Trott mir seinen do, von grünem Palmenland bis weißen Land von Schnee. Wir kommen und unser Bein mit unser Weh, und wo gefallen sie, so spritzt von unser Blut, sprotzen wir dort unser Gebore, unser Mut. Es wird die Morgensonne magilden uns dem Heind, und der Nächten wird verschwinden mit dem Feind. Nur ein paar Samen werden die Sonne in dem Kajol, wie ein paar so gehen das Lied von Dor zu Dor. Das Lied geschrien ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist nicht kein Lied von a Vogel auf der Frei. Das hat a Bock zwischen Fallen dicke Wind. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Hand. Das sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Gott Himmel bleien, verstelle bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show. Es wird abheugt und unser Trott mir seinen do.
Next, I would like to invite Ava Mays, great-granddaughter of Holocaust survivors William and Rosalie Schiff, and granddaughter of lifetime director Mike Schiff, to share William's story.
My great-grandparents, William Schiff and Rosalie Baum Schiff, were born in Krakow, Poland in 1918 and 1922. Both came from families of 3 children and had happy childhoods, but life changed with the German invasion of Poland. Despite the rapidly changing conditions, Rosalie and William met and fell in love in 1940, spending almost every day together. The next year, the Jews were forced into the ghetto. My great-grandfather's family moved in first. He secured a small apartment for my great-grandmother and her family outside of the ghetto. Food was scarce, and anti-Jewish violence on the streets was common. William often left the ghetto to visit Rosalie, bribing Polish policemen to do so. He used this opportunity to smuggle food, especially chickens, into the ghetto. Eventually, all Jews were forced into the ghetto, including my great-grandmother's family. The Germans decided to make the ghetto smaller. Anyone without a job was to be sent on a transport out of Krakow. William and his siblings had jobs, but his parents did not. He begged them to let him hide them, but they refused. He gave them all the money he had saved, and they were deported. Rosalie's mother, sister, and brother were also deported. They were all sent to their deaths. My great-grandparents managed to stay together in the ghetto and were married quickly, hoping to stay together. In her oral testimony, she remembered that day, saying, "We got married in the ghetto by a rabbi, but with a band on my arm, the Star of David, and just a few witnesses. The vows we took were so horrible. I had such a longing for a wedding, like every girl does." After they were wed, they moved in with William's sister. After all his time caring for 2 families, my great-grandfather now had only 2 people to look after. After several months, the newlyweds were moved to Plashov labor camp. My great-aunt stayed behind. Plashov, established in 1942, was built on the site of a Jewish cemetery in Krakow. Men and women were separated, but William was able to sneak away to see Rosalie. The Jews were then sent out to work. My great-grandfather remembered the cruelty of the Ukrainian guards and Polish watchmen who supervised the job sites. Beatings, hangings, and shootings were commonplace. When recording his oral testimony, he remembered a boy who was hanged in front of the inmates. They hanged him 3 times, and 3 times the rope broke. He was a kid. The 3rd time he hanged him, he shot him through the head. One day, William came back from work to find Rosalie missing. That morning, the guards had taken her to Skarżysko, a labor camp. He remembered his anger and fear in that moment. I don't know how they didn't kill me then. I jumped on everybody who was in my way. I just got furious. I was young and she was my life. My great-grandfather ran on to the next transport he saw, hoping it was headed in the same direction as my great-grandmother. It wasn't. Its destination was Auschwitz. When he arrived, my great-grandfather was tattooed and sent to work in a laboratory with a Jewish doctor, assigned to find cures for certain diseases. William was one of the people the medicines were tested on. The doctor's assistant got sick, so William was given this job, saving him from further experimentation, but he still had to witness the cruel and inhumane treatment of test subjects. He was eventually transferred to the garage to work on bicycles. Through this job for the next 2 years, my great-grandfather was able to smuggle meat to his capo, who in exchange looked after him. At Skarżysko, my great-grandmother was assigned to work in a munitions factory. She lived every day with the knowledge that the bullets they made were meant for their friends and families. As was true across Nazi-occupied territory, the camp guards regularly dehumanized the inmates. One day, Rosalie was so desperate to get rid of the lice covering her that she took a shower without permission. My great-grandmother was beaten to within an inch of her life. She was later sent to Czestochowa and assigned hard labor, breaking up rocks and carrying iron. In December of 1944, as the Russians approached from the east, about a quarter of the inmates at Czestochowa were taken west. My great-grandmother was left behind, which saved her life. She recalled, "We got up in the morning and the Germans were gone. How do you walk free on the street? Is it possible? We got out slowly from the doors, the electric wires, and we were afraid to walk on the street because we didn't know how, without the guards standing behind us and shooting and beating and shooting and beating." She was very ill and found a hospital in Czestochowa. After she recovered, she made her way to Krakow. Life for William became even worse as the Russians approached Auschwitz. The Germans began evacuating inmates in open train cars with no protection from the winter or the Ukrainian guards. After 3 days, they arrived at Gross Rosen. My great-grandfather was one of the few who survived the journey. Things at Gross Rosen were chaotic enough that he managed to escape. He went to a German home where they said they would help him, but they turned him over to the police. After he was brought back to camp, he was severely beaten. As a final punishment, he recalled, "The Nazis made a hole in the ground, put me in it just like they bury people, put me in there for 24 hours and covered me with boards. They said, 'You will never escape again.' William felt he had nothing to lose and was able to escape again. He ran for several miles, eventually resting in an empty train car. Ironically, when he woke up and opened the door, he was joined by other prisoners being transported to Buchenwald. He was once again in captivity. SS guards escorted at least 44,000 prisoners out of Gross Rosen in February 1945 to other camps. Many died of starvation or thirst along the way. SS guards also killed prisoners too weak to continue. By the time my great-grandfather and the other inmates arrived, Buchenwald was in disarray. The Allies were rapidly approaching. William became very ill just as the Nazis were preparing to evacuate. He knew he would not survive the journey and hid in his barrack. The next person to enter the barrack was an American soldier. William was taken to a hospital and he weighed 70 pounds. He recalled, "I couldn't even move, just a skeleton. It took me about 6 or 7 weeks before I started walking." Once recovered enough to travel, my great-grandfather met the doctor he worked with at the laboratory in Auschwitz. William was desperate for news of Rosalie, and the two traveled together toward Poland. They stopped briefly in Breslau, where a Russian officer commandeered a house for them. William ran into a girl he knew from home who told him Rosalie was alive. In Krakow, my great-grandmother regularly visited the Jewish Community Center, hoping for news of my great-grandfather. She had learned that her family had not survived. When she found out my great-grandfather had survived, she fainted from surprise. She went to the community center every day for the next 6 months, waiting for him. My great-grandfather finally made it back to Krakow, and they were reunited. William and Rosalie went to their family homes, but they were occupied. They decided to leave everything behind, hitchhiking to Austria and crossing the American zone with a passport my great-grandfather had received after liberation. They moved into a displaced persons camp near Linz, Austria, where my grandfather, Mike, was born, and waited to see which country would take them. My great-grandmother remembered the camp as a period of respite and wanting, as they were free but needed to heal and had no homes. She said, UNRRA sent us packages every week, and that's what we had to eat. We lived in one room, all kinds of people together from all kinds of walks of life and all kinds of nations. They moved camps a couple times in the 3 years they waited for papers, gravitating towards the American zones like many other Jews. First to Bindermickel, then to Wegscheid. One of the many challenges in immigrating from Europe was their lack of identity documents, which the camp administrators had to create for them. By mid-1946, 15,000 Jewish refugees were in Austrian DP camps. Despite overcrowding and a lack of resources, they tried their best to organize and begin their lives anew. The American Joint Distribution Committee created work projects, medical programs, and school systems. Zionist groups formed and training programs for various professions were created. William made a living as a peddler, buying and selling items for profit. In 1949, William, Rosalie, and Mike received visas for the United States, settling in Dallas by way of New Orleans. On the ocean journey, William worked in the kitchen to help pay for their passage. My great-grandfather became a repairman, then a salesman, ultimately ending up in real estate. My great-grandmother raised my grandfather and his 2 siblings, and eventually became a beautician. She struggled for years with nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat every night. Both of my great-grandparents strongly believed people should be educated about the Holocaust. As my great-grandfather said, things like this cannot happen again. The world has to know about it, to educate the world to know how to prevent it. They were instrumental in the founding of the original Dallas Memorial Center for Holocaust Studies, and my great-grandmother spoke frequently at the museum. I am very proud to share their legacy and story with you today. I would now like to light a candle in memory of 1 million out of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust.
This song, Sprent, that you can find on page 8 by Mordechai Gebirtig, tells a story. And this is a story of a shtetl on fire. And what moved the poet to write was not just that the shtetl was on fire, but that people just stood unable to act. And so this song asks us in every generation to douse the flames of hate before it's too late.
Brennt, Brüderlachs brennt, hoi unser Orm Städtel nebach brennt, Böse Winden mit ihr Gosen, reißen, brechen und zerblasen, starker noch die wilde Flammen, als Arun schon brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt da so sich mit verlängter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt da so sich, unser Städtel brennt. Brennt, Brüder, lachs brennt, oi unser Orm Städtel nebach brennt. So bin schon die Feierzungen, das ganze Städtel eins geschlungen, und die böse Windenhosen, unser Städtel brennt. Und ihr steht und guckt da so sich mit verlängter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt da so sich, unser Städtel brennt. Es brennt, Brüderlechs brennt, oi ist kein Cholile kommen der Moment. Unser Stadt mit uns zusammen soll ab Aschab weg in Flammen bleiben, soll wie noch ein Schlag, nur Pust der schwarze Wind. Und ihr steht und guckt da so sich mit verlängter Hand. Und ihr steht und guckt da so sich, unser Städtel brennt. Es brennt, Brüderlechs brennt. Die Hilfe ist nur in euch allein gewähnt. Ob das Städtel is ach teuer, nehmt die Kehlem, löscht das Feier. Löscht mit euer eigen Blut, wer weiß, als ihr das kennt. Steht nicht, Brüder, oder soll sich mit verlängter Hand. Steht nicht, Brüder, löscht das Feier, unser Städtel brennt.
Next, I would like to invite Rivka Altman, granddaughter of Mike Jacobs, to share his story.
My grandfather, Mike Jacobs, was born Mendel Yakubowicz on December 29, 1924, in Konin, Poland. His father, Moshe, was a merchant, and his mother, Dora, was a housewife. Together, they raised my Zadie and his 5 older siblings, Avraham, Rivka, Esther, Shlomo, and Ruvain. Their Orthodox family was especially close and worked hard to make ends meet. The Nazis came to Konin in October 1939. From that time, nothing would be the same for the Jews. My Zadie remembers losing his freedom bit by bit. His right to go to school, to move freely, to walk the streets without fear. As he said in his testimony, the Nazis took hostages, Jewish people and non-Jewish people. They put them in jail. They took all of the intelligentsia, the teachers, and brought them out to the Jewish cemetery, and they were shot. In late November, the Nazis forced my Zadie and his family to relocate east to the ghetto in Ostrovitz. At age 14, Mike first became involved with the resistance activities in the ghetto. With one of his brothers, he would go out and organize with farmers and with German soldiers. Stealing was a dirty word, my Zadie would say. Organizing was more sophisticated. They organized bread, flour, meat, and sugar to bring to their families in the ghetto. In these times of great scarcity, he even managed to organize oranges from the basement of the nearby brewery using a special coat his brothers made. Doctors in the ghettos were able to give these oranges to the most malnourished of the patients. In 1942, Mike's grandparents and 4 of his aunts and uncles were deported to Treblinka and murdered. Only my Zadie and his brother Ruvain managed to escape the transport line. Shortly after, Ruvain joined the Jewish underground. He was killed by Polish partisans in 1943. At age 16, my Zadie was on his own. He worked under an SS officer responsible for cleaning out the now empty big ghetto, going from house to house, knocking on walls, and looking for hidden valuables. During this time, he saw unspeakable violence from the SS officers who killed indiscriminately. In the small ghetto, my Zadie continued his resistance work, buying guns and ammunition from a German soldier and providing them to the underground. When it became clear that the ghetto was going to be liquidated, my Zadie took the false papers he had managed to obtain and escaped. With his blonde hair and blue eyes, he relied on his Polish looks to leave the city and travel the Polish countryside. He lived in constant fear that he would be discovered as a Jew. Ultimately, he returned to the labor camp in Ostrowitz because of the high risk of discovery. The underground contacted my Zadie again while he was in the labor camp, asking him to derail a train traveling to Ostrowitz. Using only a small wrench, he loosened the bolts on the railroad tracks and derailed a Panzer train, causing a large explosion. He remained at the labor camps until August 2nd, 1944, when he was transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. At first glance, Mike recalled, "I said to my friends, 'Take a look, we came to paradise. It's clean, the orchestra is playing, welcoming us, everybody's smiling and laughing. I saw smoke coming out of the chimneys, and I said to my friends, this is a fine place. Look, they have big bakeries here. When they ask me what profession I'm in, I'm going to say I'm a baker. I will never go hungry.' At the initial selection, he drew himself up on his toes to look taller and was sent to the right. Those sent to the left never returned. It did not take long for my Zadie to realize what the chimneys were for, and that was not paradise. During his time in Auschwitz, he recalled being tormented by the constant music. In the morning, we used to get a little slice of bread with our Sats coffee, a synthetic coffee. We went to work by orchestra. We came home by orchestra. People were tortured by orchestra. The best musicians in Europe were performing, because when they said, you're going to want to take what you can carry, this means the musicians would take their instruments. The Nazis knew who were good musicians and what you played. The SS sent Mike to Camp D, the working camp. He was assigned to the Zerlig, a scrapyard, where prisoners took apart German planes and sent them to the mills to be melted and reformed. Using machine guns from the planes and other scraps, he fashioned smaller guns that he then smuggled to the Sonderkommando, Jewish prisoners assigned to working in the crematoria, who were planning on an uprising. On October 7th, 1944, the members of the Sonderkommando at Crematorium 4 revolted. Though the crematorium was partially destroyed, the uprising was quickly suppressed. 250 prisoners died in the fighting, and the SS shot and killed another 200 for their involvement. Mike says he survived Auschwitz by dreaming and fantasizing. I closed my eyes, and I was a bird. And I flew out, and I was free. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the same surroundings. But for a few moments, while I was dreaming and fantasizing, I was a free person. I was free. I was somebody again. The most precious thing a person can have or possess is to be free. I never lost my hope, never lost my belief. In January 1945, Soviet soldiers drew close to Auschwitz. On the morning of January 19th, the SS forced my Zadie and other prisoners on a death march from Auschwitz-Birkenau. They traveled over 30 kilometers in snow each day without food or water before reaching Mauthausen. The guards murdered many prisoners en route. In his biography, my Zadie remembers that the snow on the side of the road wasn't white, but red with the blood of prisoners. Mike ended up in Gusen II, a sub-camp of Mauthausen, where he worked in a factory building German planes. He continued his resistance activities, sabotaging the planes in such a way that the inspectors would not catch the fault. On May 5, 1945, Maizadi and his fellow prisoners were liberated by the 11th Armored Division of the U.S. Third Army. He was 19 years old and weighed 70 pounds. When he finally walked out of the camp, he stopped and looked around, finally free of the barbed wire. Mike later noted that he had a moment of realization as he stepped out of the grounds. Nobody's waiting for me. Nobody's welcoming me. Where do I go? I have no home. I have no home to go to. After liberation, he traveled to Linz, Austria, then on to Mittenwald, Germany, where American soldiers were congregating. He worked in the kitchen and became a leader in organizing surviving Jews. He recalled that at first, many Jews were nervous to put their names on lists, thinking about what might happen if the list fell into the wrong hands. But Maizadi showed them how this would aid them in finding other surviving family members, and they wrote down their information. He joined the Jewish displaced persons in Munich, where his goal was to aid survivors in regaining their physical health. Survivors were able to move freely now, so the group sent him around to the camps to organize sports clubs, to develop better bodies and tell them how important it was to have exercise and to build up their bodies again. Maizadi grew accustomed to life in Germany, participating in and setting records at track and field events called Maccabia, organized by displaced persons. He played soccer, organized teams, and even began to teach gymnastics to German children, noting they were not to blame for the Holocaust. Maizadi was also a proud Zionist. There was a wonderful photo of him raising an Israeli flag with others at Mittenwald around the time of the birth of the new state. He studied to be a gymnast and calisthenics teacher in Mittenwald, knowing it was only temporary, but he just didn't know where his life would take him. For a time, he considered going to Israel, but he was not prepared to fight in a war. He then planned to leave for Sweden with his cousin Avraham, but when those plans fell through, he set his sights on the United States. That path was not easy. His immigration was delayed after someone falsely reported that he may have been a communist, forcing him to wait even longer for a chance at a new life. In 1951, he was accepted to go to the United States. Due to a clerical error, he ended up in Dallas. Despite his joking prediction that he would become a cowboy, he worked in the scrap metal business and met and married my grandmother, Ginger, and had 4 children. Mike would ultimately discover that he lost more than 80 family members in the Holocaust. Other than 2 cousins, he was the lone survivor. Maizadi passed away in 2014. However, his legacy lives on in his family, his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and the original Dallas Memorial Center for Holocaust Studies, which he founded with a group of area survivors. He shared his story often, saying, "I'm here to share with you and the future generations my experience, what one human can do to another. If we sit back and say, it's not going to be me, it's going to be the next guy, I'm here to tell you that story. It was a Holocaust. 6 million Jewish people died. Non-Jewish people died too. I will never tire to tell people what one human can do to another. So long as we know about it, I believe we will not let it happen again. No, silence and complacency is the biggest killer." I would now like to light a candle in memory of 1 million of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust.
God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant fitting rest on the wings of the divine presence in the heights of the holy and the pure, who shine like the radiance of the heaven for the souls of the 6 million Jews, the victims of the Shoah in Europe. Please rise if you are able for the memorial prayer, the El Malei Rachamim, found on page 11.
El Malei Rachamim, shochein b'meroimim, חומסי מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את כל הנשמות של 6 מיליוני היהודים חללי השואה באירופה שנהרגו, שנשחטו, שנשרפו ושנספו על קידוש השם בידי המרצחים גם המנצחים יימח שמם מעוזריהם משערי עמים לכן ברחמים יסתירי בסדר כנפיו לעולמים ויצור מצור החיים את נשמותיהם אדוני הוא נחלתם בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם ויעמדו לגורלם לקץ הימים ונאמר אמן.
As we now recite Kaddish in memory of all of those who were brutally murdered during the Shoah, I invite all of my colleagues of clergy that are in attendance to please join me on the bima as we recite Kaddish together. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah v'yalma tivrach iruteh v'yamlich malchuteh v'chayachon v'yomechon v'chayeh v'chol beit Yisrael ba'agala v'zman kariv v'yimru amen. Yehei shmei rabbah mevarach le'alam ulanei almaya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקדושה ברכו אלא מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דאמירם בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום ממרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.
I would now like to welcome Ike Brown, Board Chair of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, to give closing remarks.
Good evening, and thanks for being here. I'm Mike Brown and have the pleasure of serving as the board chair of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. On behalf of the board and the staff of the museum, I want to thank everyone for joining us for this deeply moving ceremony of remembrance. 81 years ago, the camps were liberated. But as you've seen tonight, liberation did not mean survivors could simply return to the homes and the lives that they had before the war. Most Jewish survivors were unable to return to Eastern Europe due to the destruction of their communities and ongoing anti-Semitism. So many survivors migrated westward to territories liberated by the Allies, with the eventual goal of leaving Europe entirely. From 1945 to 1952, more than 250,000 Jewish displaced persons lived in camps and urban centers in Germany, Austria, and Italy. This period was marked by grief, uncertainty, and reckoning with unbelievable loss. This was compounded by the fact that many displaced persons camps were located on the sites of former concentration camps. But as we heard tonight, survivors rebuilt their lives piece by piece. Family members were reunited. Young people got married and had babies in the camps, creating new families. They rebuilt their physical strength, and they made communities where they stood, transforming the camps into active Jewish cultural and social centers. And when the time came, they left the DP camps ready for a new chapter. As we all know, a few of these survivors made their way to Dallas. Without the courage of these individuals, the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, as we know it today, would not exist. The founders of the museum and the community surrounding them crafted a sacred place for remembrance, serving as a home to both horrific history and noble moments. 42 years later, the museum remains steadfast in its mission to teach the history of the Holocaust and advance human rights to combat prejudice, hatred, and indifference. I would like to conclude tonight as Mary Pat began, with gratitude. Thank you to our survivors for their remarkable strength, courage, and example. Thank you, Rabbi Kushnick and Congregation Anshai Torah, for being such wonderful hosts, and to our speakers, Dylan and Garrett Gasworth, Ava Maez, and Rivka Altman. Thank you also to Chazan Osterklein for the beautiful and uplifting music, Gloria Stamen and Earl Bloom for coordinating this program, and our museum volunteers this evening. And finally, thank you to everyone who generously supported this commemoration with poignant tributes in the program book. We are living in turbulent and uncertain times, so we must all embody the mission of the museum. We must all be upstanders. I'd now like to light our last memorial candle for the evening as our program concludes with Hatikva. I will light the candle in memory of 1 million of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Thank you all for being with us this evening.
עוד לא אבדה תקוותנו, please rise as we face the דגל של ישראל for התקווה.
כל עוד בלב הפנימה נפש יהודי הומיע ולפתי מזרח קדימה עין לציון סופיה עוד לא אבדה תקוותנו התקווה בת שנות 2000 להיות עם חופשי בארצנו ארץ ציון בירושלים להיות עם חופשי בארצנו ארץ ציון בירושלים.
Thank you all so much for being with us this evening. Survivors, I hope we see you again very soon. Please travel safely. Have a good evening.